Okay, let's get underway. Open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 10, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 10. I'm running a little bit late because I had to rush over and pray with all the seniors, our high school seniors, having a big brunch over in Jubilee Center today. The food looked and smelled wonderful, but they only wanted me to do a prayer and get out of the way, so that's what I did. It's very special, of course, to me to see these young people, most of whom I baptized in the first 2 or 3 months of their lives. I handed them third grader Bibles. I placed my hands on their head and confirmed them in our faith. And now to see them graduate high school is very special. At 8:30, we had all those who were graduating from high school and any level of college to stand. And one right back near the back was Ben Pasco. And unless you've stood in the pulpit where all the television lights are focused, you don't realize it's really difficult to see faces back that far. And so people down front were sort of snickering, and I couldn't figure out what, and they were pointing, and then I saw Ben back there doing like this, that he's graduating. If you don't know Ben, he is an outstanding young man. He's graduating Phi Beta Kappa this month and is going on to Perkins School of Theology at SMU. But last summer, he was one of our venture leadership team members here at the church. And my 2 grandsons were participating in one of the summer weeks here at the church. Audra had asked me if I would come and give a devotional one morning at breakfast. This was their mission week, and they were sleeping here and having breakfast here and then going into various parts of Tulsa to work all week. Well, Ben had been assigned to the group that my 2 little grandsons were both in, and he had introduced him. I did not know this at the time. He had told them, "Oh, I know who you are. Your grandfather and I are just like this." So that morning, early, I had gotten ready to go to work and rushed down here to give their devotional that morning. And when I walked in, I saw him at the table with all these little boys, and I said, "Jeff, how are you?" That's his older brother. His older brother's named Jeff, and my 2 grandsons looked at him, as if, "Yeah, right. You and my granddad are like this. He doesn't even know your name." I did know his name, but I somehow transposed with his older brother, Jeff. Anyway, he's an outstanding young man, and I was so excited, first of all, of course, when he felt that God was calling him to be a minister, and second, that he chose my alma mater to go to for his graduate work. He applied at 2 others, both Methodist institutions as well, and I would have been happy for him to go to anyone, but happiest for him to go to Perkins at SMU, and I'm really glad that he is. I saw Grant Carpenter just before the service began. What an outstanding young man he is. Those of you who worship at 8:30 saw Grant grow up in our church, sing in the choir always, play the lead in Oklahoma in our summer musical, did all kinds of things, and has been on scholarship at SMU 3 years now. He's a voice major, and I saw him back there just before the 8:30 service started, and he told me he had just ordered his senior ring, and I said, "I still have mine. Grant, still wear mine." And he said that he hoped to wear one as long as I have. And he's being featured today here at Boston Avenue at 12:30 in recital. He's going to do about 30 minutes, I think. And Joel Pansera says, "Wow, how his voice has continued to mature, and the splendid training that he's received at SMU. He's just all the better. He is a voice major at SMU. And so to see these young people do so very well and leave the nest and continue to do well is a special blessing. Let's pray. God, thank you for your book. We are eager to learn what you are to teach us, and we pray that we will understand and dedicate ourselves to those things that you were able to impart into minds who were willing to receive so long ago, and then to call still great minds and hearts who translate for us, who write commentary for us, so that we have an all the better chance of understanding what you really have to say to us. And we pray we will understand and apply what we hear to the living of our lives. In Christ's name, amen. Well, I may say more about our vacation later, but just a word of appreciation to all of you who've been here at Sunday school, and you've been here at worship, and you've continued to give as we move towards summer now and have so many programs cranking up for children and youth. We really have a lot of things that we want to do and believe are important to be done, and we appreciate your helping make those happen. Because we had been to Israel in February with a wonderful group of 43 people from our church, Gail and I decided that we were going to stay a little closer to home this time. And I had knee surgery a couple of months ago, as you know, and I didn't know just how that was going to hold up. So we, were a little bit late putting everything together. But this time we were determined to see New York City and Washington, D.C. in ways that we had not seen them before. We had seen a couple of plays on Broadway many years ago when our boys were still at home and with us in seeing them. But we didn't really have the money back then to see as many of the museums and plays and so on as we would like. So now that we've seen some of the great capitals in the world and some of the great museums of the world, we wanted to see how our museums, institutions hold up in New York and Washington. And Gail and I are not credentialed art observers, but we would tell you that in our opinion, our museums hold up really well. I saw Rick Steves on television last night saying the greatest art museum in the world is the Prado in Madrid. We've been to the Prado. It is outstanding. It is one of the great museums of the world, but to say it has the greatest paintings in the world, please. There are lots of great museums, and from the Louvre to Florence to Rome, now to New York and Washington. From a kid that grew up at a compressor station in Panola County, Texas, I still almost pinch myself to think I'm standing in a room filled with Rembrandt's paintings. I'm standing in a room filled with Vincent van Gogh's, in a room filled with Henri Matisse or Monet, all these great ones. It's really, really amazing. We appreciate Dr. Spencer Brown and Mary Wheeler coaching us along on things we should see in New York. We tried to see everything possible that we could in 10 days. And we really moved. Gail kept saying, when does our rest day come? When does our rest day come? We were going from early morning until far into the night. We stayed in Yankee Stadium one night till midnight to try to help the Yankees beat the Kansas City Royals. Just because we were in New York, we didn't want anybody clubbing us in the head because we were rooting for Kansas City. And then rode a subway, from 161st Street in the Bronx down to the southernmost part of Manhattan Island where our hotel was, not so far from Ground Zero. After midnight was a little spooky for us, but it worked out great. The new Yankee Stadium is really beautiful, and we got to see 2 ball games while we were there. We saw 2 of the Yankee games, and those of you who like baseball, you'd love going into the outfield, beyond the outfield wall, and seeing their memorial garden, I think they call it. Anyway, they've got busts there of everybody from Yogi Berra and Babe Ruth. Mickey Mantle, of course, is highly acclaimed there, and so many others. It's a fun place to see a ball game. We had a great time. We got to see 2 plays while we were there. We went to see Lombardi, and Gail and I both thought it was terrific. The fellow who played the father in The Wonder Years on television, Frank Lauria, is an Italian himself. And I think he probably had a little tooth plate made to get that gap between the teeth that Lombardi had. But I tell you, he looked like Vince Lombardi. He's built like Lombardi. He can talk like Lombardi, because I remember Lombardi on television and everything. And he was terrific. What was the actress's? Judith Light. Some of you women might know. I did not know her as well. She played Mrs. Lombardi, and she was terrific. They gave her a lot of great lines. And Gail wasn't into football back when Lombardi was coaching, so I had read reviews of the play, and I knew that 3 of his players were featured in the play. And so I had told her who Paul Hornung was and what she could probably expect from him. Jimmy Taylor, some of you remember him when he was a great fullback for LSU and then went on to the Green Bay Packers. And if you were a football fan back then in the 60s, you remember that Lombardi had said, I will have one play. He called it 48, where the 4-back goes through the 8-hole, and he wanted his 2 guards, 2 of the best in the business at that time, out front of that ball carrier, and Jimmy Taylor in front of the ball carrier, and then Paul Hornung carrying the ball. And he said, everybody's going to know we're going to run it, and we're going to run it anyway, because we're going to run it better than anybody else can run. It was fun, but also very poignant about the pressures that are brought to bear on people. The other was Steve Robinson, by the way. I didn't mean to leave him out. Robinson was a great receiver, an African-American receiver on that team. And so those 3 players featured in the play, and then just Lombardi, his wife, and a reporter who had been assigned to spend a week with Lombardi and try to figure out who this guy really is at that time. It was great. We enjoyed it. And then we got tickets to that championship season. I don't know if you've seen or read that play. Kiefer Sutherland plays. By the way, I don't know Kiefer Sutherland at all, but I know some of the work he's done. And most recently, of course, he's been known for the series 24. And he's about the size of Bill Tankersley. I was expecting, almost something bigger, stronger, and tougher looking. No, he's about the size of Bill Tankersley. But he had one of the lead roles. It's a 5-man show. All the players in this show are men, and Chris Noth from Sex and the Single Woman So On series. He's been on Law and Order. He was on when it very first started. Now The Good Wife. He plays the scoundrel on The Good Wife. Mr. Patrick, who wrote the play nearly 40 years ago, now has a son who played one of the 5 leads. So the playwright's son, Jason Patrick, was one of the 5 players. I didn't know the other 2. But those 3, and the other 2 were equally capable, it seemed to us. Gail kept saying she wasn't hearing it quite as well and not picking up on some of the lines. It's about an old basketball team who won a big championship 20 years before, and now they've come together for a reunion. And one of the 5 is the coach, and the other 4 were players. And what's happened in their lives in the last 20 years. They're roughly 38 at that point. This is about a high school championship basketball season that meant the world to them, and the trophies there in the coach's home and all this. And it's about that championship season and sort of the lies they've told themselves about what that season was and what it really was and so on. And we thought, I particularly enjoyed it. Gail didn't enjoy that one quite as much, but I thought it was terrific as well. So we had a great time. Mayor Wheeler and Dr. Brown, we love the big museums, but one of our favorites was the Frick collection. We just thought it was absolutely amazing. It was outstanding. And the Guggenheim, of course, as we were told, the architecture is so amazing. I'd never seen a 9-story building that none of the floors is level. I mean, flat. The whole thing is like a corkscrew, sort of like this, and the floors just keep ascending. And you can see from the ground floor, you can see all the way to the top. There's an atrium, and there are little side rooms off this spiral so that you can move in and right back, but you're always, not quite standing level. It just keeps you moving up all the way. The building is magnificent. Gail's not as much into the Impressionist art. I like it a little bit more than she does. But anyway, the artwork there is not the old masters of the Renaissance period, the Rembrandts and so on, but Titian and Caravaggio and a lot of those. But nonetheless, magnificent, just magnificent. I did not know that all of our great museums in Washington are free. We taxpayers provide all of those terrific museums, and they're free. They're not free in New York, but they're free in Washington. Anybody can walk up and go into a museum in Washington, D.C. Gail and I love museums of natural history. We spent 7 hours in the one in New York City. I couldn't believe, when we finally looked at our watch, we had been in that museum 7 hours one day. It was really, because we love the big dinosaurs and all that they're learning about how humans came to be Homo sapien and so on. And we found all of that so very, very interesting. Museums today, of course, have changed in that they use a lot more video, that's not the right word, visual aids of all kinds, a little room here, a little room there. And what we found was that so many of these places, the presentation they were showing, when you got to the end of it, it had already been performed by the History Channel. The History Channel put many of these together. The Cohn sisters in New York. We enjoyed Etta and Claire's work, and I had read a little bit about Etta Cohn and Gertrude Stein, and they were good friends and buddies. But to see their collection, their brother, this was a Jewish family that came to this country with virtually nothing and got into the cotton business. And very successful in the cotton business, and sold cotton to another very famous person in time named Levi Strauss. And so they sold cotton for making blue jeans. These two sisters decided never to marry, just to take an annual stipend from their brother, who was making all this money, and travel. And they spent so many of their years in Paris, in London, and Rome. And they got to meet all these young artists, Pablo Picasso, and they had paintings that they paid Picasso $50 for, $75 when he needed the rent on his apartment. Well, they had a wonderful presentation on these two sisters' lives, actual footage, film footage of them and so on, and they just kept collecting. Their favorite was Henri Matisse. They loved Matisse best of all, and so they were buying everything he was painting there at one time, so he flew to New York and made appearances with them and so on. Those kinds of things made it very, very interesting. Those of you, Ellis, the Jenkins here, isn't the arena at University of Tulsa where they play basketball, isn't it Donald W. Reynolds? Well, this must be the same foundation. When we went to Valley Forge, Mount Vernon, there is a beautiful new educational center there, the Donald W. Reynolds.
It's probably the same, because they have facilities throughout the United States.
I didn't know that. I thought it was, well, this is terrific. This is beautiful. In Mount Vernon itself, they don't allow any food or drink. They did have bottled water. That's it. Otherwise, once you enter into the main gate, no eating and drinking and littering the grounds of Mount Vernon. But just, you buy your ticket, and then you're in the Reynolds Center. And here again, these wonderful video presentations, if you want to see them before you go onto the grounds themselves, and done by the History Channel. All of these agencies have really used the History Channel and monies that they've spent in stories about George Washington and Martha Washington and crossing the Delaware that fateful Christmas and so on. It was really a magnificent place, just beautiful, absolutely beautiful. We had not been to Mount Vernon since 1976. We took our kids, who were this big at the time, on a bicentennial trip that summer. A lot of special things were being done when our country was 200 years old, and we thought that'd be a great learning experience for our kids. And we started at Jamestown. I mean, we really wanted to sort of put this in perspective for them. And we started at Jamestown and then Williamsburg and ended up, we did Washington, D.C. We went to Gettysburg Battlefield. We gave them a day off at Hershey Park in Pennsylvania. We went to Philadelphia and saw the Liberty Bell and all. Well, Gail and I had not been back to Mount Vernon since 1976. And I didn't remember that they were still farming so much to show you what it really looked like. And I don't know if they were in 1976, but they are now. I didn't remember that George and Martha Washington had 8,000 acres in that farm. I didn't remember its being so big. It was just amazing that there were 8,000 acres in that farm. And but here again, also interaction of people. They had a woman at Mount Vernon who now plays Lady Martha Washington. It's not a play. It's an ongoing conversation. People can come in, and here's Lady Washington seated in a rocking chair with all of her beautiful gown and everything. When we were at Smithsonian, we saw the inaugural gowns of all the first ladies. Gail kept looking at that one for Martha Washington and said, "That's not the Martha Washington I've seen. Her waist was about this big." Well, the woman at Mount Vernon looks like the 75-year-old Martha Washington. She was terrific. We were told by a lady just outside, and it's sort of like Williamsburg now. I don't remember they're doing this in 1976, but they are now. And there was a woman in costume just outside, and sort of monitoring how many could get into this room with Lady Washington at any given time. And she said there are a lot of school kids in there right now. As soon as they get tired and leave, you'll be next in. So we sat down, and then another couple about our age walked up, and here came a big group of students out, and she said, "Okay, now you can go in." So when we went in, the front row was open, so the 4 adults sat down on the front. And then in came the next big troop of kids, and it turned out they were 13 years old, that age when they ought to be locked up on a reservation somewhere. And they were talking, and she said, please sit down. And they sat. And she said, "This is a time for you to ask me any question you would like. I will respond to any question." And one little girl, she said, "Please, did you not see that there are 4 adults here, and adults should be heard from first?" She said, "I remember when I was first invited to the table with adults, I was 13, and I knew I was not to speak unless someone spoke to me. And the same is true for you, young lady. Wait your turn." And she turned to Gail and me and the other couple and said, "Did you have any questions?" And we did have 2 or 3, and we asked the questions. And this young lady, but she's not making any noise. She just went. And so she got to her. About that time, 4 of the boys in this class, jumped up and started to leave. She said, "Hold it. That is not a proper way to exit my chambers here." And she told them, that they should bow from the waist and say, "Lady Washington, we need to go now. May we be excused?" And they bowed from the waist and asked Lady Washington if they could be excused, and she dismissed them. And then in 3 or 4 minutes, the young ladies all wanted to jump up and leave. And she said, "Please, there's also a proper way and improper way for you to leave the presence of adults. Please, young ladies, hold your hands in front of your waist like this, and then bow and so on and say, 'Thank you for inviting us into your home, Lady Washington. We need to go now.'" She had them get tick, tick, tick right down there. She was wonderful. And she looked like the Martha Washington Gail remembered seeing. The physician who attended George Washington when he died is now played. George Washington had known him for years and made him Surgeon General of the United States when he became president. He was a Scotsman, and this fellow plays it with a broad Scottish accent, and he was terrific. Again, in a separate room, another part of the farm, and he was there just to answer questions. And you could ask him, what killed the general? He said, an infected epiglottis. Now, I've been making hospital calls 50 years, and I've never visited anybody that had an infected epiglottis, as I recall. But he said he had an infection right in that part of the throat, and that within 36 hours he died, that he suffocated. There was such swelling that he died. 2 years after he got home to the farm, after being president, he was dead. But then I asked a question of him. I said, my wife and I were talking, about the fact that Martha had been married before and had children. Her husband was killed, and she and Mr. Washington were married, but he never fathered a child. Any thoughts on that? And he said, it wasn't for lack of trying. And everybody in the room looked around. And then he said, I can assure you that Washington spent much wonderful time together. But he did then answer very seriously, that in fact childbirth was very difficult back in those days, and Martha had given birth to 4. At 17, she married a man who was 37, 20 years her senior, and by the time she was 26, she had had 4 children. 2 of them died very young. One died in an epileptic seizure at 17, and the last of her 4 was killed at the Battle of Yorktown. She lost all 4 of her children. And the grandchildren of that son, the children of the son, her grandchildren, grew up with her and George then. And Mr. Washington was away at war for 8 years and then was president for 8 years, of course. So anyway, Lady Washington was glad to talk about both of those times. I did not know that she followed him during the war, but she said, oh yes, she went to every battlefield and so on, and she tended the sick and acted as a nurse to be near the general at all times during that war for 8 years. So then they had the granddaughter of Martha and the general, also in costume and answering questions. It was cleverly done, really wonderfully done. So we came away all the prouder of being, Americans. New York City is a United Nations. You see every face, hear every voice under the sun. If you ride the subways like we did for 10 days and nights, you hear Russian, you hear Polish, you hear German, you hear French, you hear Italian, you hear lots of Spanish. It's unbelievable. And Washington, D.C. is the same. It really is amazing. Our hotel in Washington was actually just outside the D.C. area. Got a lot better rates that way. So every morning we went through the metro station at the Pentagon. That was closest to our hotel. And so we went into the metro station. And here again, the people who were going into the Pentagon were every size and shape you can imagine. And a number of them, markedly Muslim women, with the headscarves and everything, working at the Pentagon. I was sort of surprised by that. Our last day in Washington, I had mentioned to Gail that I would like to go to the home of Frederick Douglass. And she said, okay, that sounded interesting to her too. We had been hearing things about Mr. Lincoln and how he had come to know Frederick Douglass and so on. You recall that Frederick Douglass was a slave who managed to escape as a very young man, was found to have unusual oratorical skills, and actually was taken by the abolitionist group to London and Paris, where he made speeches for freeing the slaves in America and so on. Came back somewhat of a celebrity to this country. Was a personal friend of Harriet Tubman, who was going south and helping slaves get onto the Underground Railroad and so on. He became owner of a newspaper, and that newspaper became very influential, and at one point then had bought a very nice home in Washington. And that home has been preserved all these years. Well, Gail and I rode the metro to the stop nearest his home. And my brother, when he was with the Dallas Police Department, shortly after his Vietnam experience, he said, if you ever find yourself in Dallas at 2 o'clock in the morning, at the corner of Martin Luther King Drive and Malcolm X Boulevard, you've made a wrong turn. And we ended up that day saying, now, how's the best way to walk from the Douglas home to the subway, the metro? And they said, well, you just go right down here to Martin Luther King Drive and you turn left on Thurgood Marshall Avenue. We didn't see a white face. We did not see a white face. When we walked in, every person who worked there, and it does now belong to the National Park System, Department of the Interior, all of them were African American. Everybody. Every other visitor there, African American. We were the only two white people there. And when we, went, we saw again an orientation film on his life done by the History Channel, and we then could go up to the house. He managed to amass 17 acres in a suburb of Washington back shortly after the time of the Civil War. And this acreage is still beautifully kept up now by the National Park Service, and the home is a beautiful 2-story home with additional bedrooms and an attic space up there. When we walked on up the high steps to the house right up on the hill, and the young park guide who was conducting people through, Gail said, he looked, his eyes sort of popped when he looked. Here were 2 white people to see Frederick Douglass's home. But anyway, it was very, very interesting, and nobody gave us any trouble at all. Everybody was very kind, and we enjoyed and were blessed by seeing it. So these two great cities, we were really, really impressed with them. It's an education to ride subways and metros and buses. We rode city buses, particularly in the Washington, D.C. area. You see a whole different side of the world when you ride public transportation and ride it for 18 days. We rode public transportation every day. We didn't take a single taxi. We rode subways, metros, buses, and both cities. And we got along fine. Gail and I were amazed of all the people in New York City we saw who were so kind to us. Not one ugly New Yorker. Not one. In 10 days. In some of those big stations where you have 4 or 5 lines crossing, and you have to be on one platform to go uptown or another platform to go downtown, and you've got 5 lines crossing with 2 platforms each. I mean, it's amazing. Signage is not always really good. And every time we would just say to somebody, and everybody's hurrying to get wherever they're going, we would say, the A line goes where, to go uptown. And they not only would stop to tell us, they would often walk us, to the next junction and say, no, you just go here, you just turn there, whatever. It was wonderful. When we got to Washington, D.C., our very first bus ride, after the metro, then the bus, there were some 3, these were people who talked like we did and sort of looked like we did, and they were talking with us, and Gail, they said, where are you from? We're from Tulsa. Oh, you just arrived? Yes, we came by train. We took the Amtrak Express from New York City down to Washington. There's an express train that makes that run in 2 hours and 45 minutes. And we took that train down, and it was on time. By George, it was on time, and that worked out fine. But anyway, Gail was saying, we've just been 10 days in New York, and we have not met one ugly New Yorker. No one. And this older gentleman said, well, I hope Washington can measure up, that you'll be treated as well here. And we were. We absolutely were treated just the same. We had no unhappy experiences with people. Everybody that we met, extremely kind. New York was under heightened alert. We arrived the morning after the killing of Osama bin Laden. And so everything in New York was saying, be aware, be aware. They had police officers, dozens everywhere you looked in the subway system, police officers. And not only with their usual sidearms, but we saw a number of them with automatic weapons, rifles, like we saw in Israel. And Gail said, this is sort of like Israel, these people walking around with weapons. And broad, messages all the time in the subway system. If you see something, tell somebody. If you feel uncomfortable, tell somebody. At one point, Gail and I were standing on a platform, and she looked across at the train platform that was going in the opposite direction, and there was a little package there, right by one of the columns. And she pointed out to me, and I said, yes, I see it. And she turned to a police officer and told him, there's a little package over there by that post. And he said, it's probably just garbage, but I would check it out. And he did. So they were really on heightened alert. Everybody, really trying to be aware, to be sensitive to what was going on around them. We went to Ground Zero. Many of you have been to the church that was just across the street and survived. The church survived intact. This is the oldest continuous church in New York. There still is a box there where President Washington and Martha worshipped. You were told that the minute he was inaugurated in New York, when the Capitol was there, you recall his first term, when he was inaugurated in New York, the first thing he did was walk down the street to that church and pray at the altar. When we walked in to this little church, there is a huge banner up over the doors. You have to walk in and then turn and look up over the doors. A huge banner from the people of Oklahoma. Because of the Murrah bombing, they felt Oklahomans understand. After 9/11, we understand. And here they have kept it, since 2001. It's been there nearly 10 years. This big banner with lots of signatures of Oklahomans, hundreds. We Oklahomans, send our prayers. It was really special to be close and aware of what was going on. Let me tell you the most unusual thing. You always wonder if you are in a strange place that's that big, if you'll see anybody you know. We had two experiences. The first night we went to the Yankee ball game, they were not in town when we first arrived. And we knew they weren't going to be there until our last two nights. So when they arrived back in the city and were playing the Kansas City Royals, Gail and I had gone to the box office earlier in the day and bought our tickets and so on. So we got there, and we want to be there in time to go out and see the statues of all these Yankee greats. And finally, we're walking in to get us something to eat. How many thousands of people are there at Yankee Stadium on that night? And here was one of our women Methodist preachers from Oklahoma, Ann Needham. I said, Ann, who's on? Ann decided many years ago to go to work for the Board of Global Ministries in New York. And she was a member of the ministerial team at the Board of Global Ministries in New York City for many, many years. But retired, and she and George came back to Oklahoma. I had read a few months ago that George had died. Ann said, I have brought George's cremains back to New York. That we had so many good times in the Catskills that George wanted his cremains to be placed in the Catskills. And so I called some of my former colleagues, and they said, well, if you're coming into the city, you got to go to a Yankee ball game. And so the three women were there with her that night, and they were all going with her the next day or two up into the Catskills to deposit George's ashes as cremains. So that was one thing. The other thing was, Gail and I are in Times Square fairly early one morning, and we're walking right through Times Square, and all of a sudden, I see a face I know. I start my morning every morning with the Today Show. I don't know. I've preferred that group since Tom Brokaw and all the way back there. And I've told you I have a little television set in the bathroom. that plays behind me, and I can see it in the mirror while I'm shaving and so on. Well, when the cameras pan round, when Matt Lauer and Meredith Veer and so on go outside, Al Roker, the cameras pan around and pick up tourists. One day I was watching and our Harvey Rowe was on there, There's Harvey Rowe. I didn't know he was in New York. Harvey said, well, he just thought he'd walk down. Well, there is an African-American man who stands at the same spot every day. And I've heard them say, morning, Lenny, how are you? Hi, Lenny, how are you? And he's not a talker. He just nods his head to them. He's there when it's snowing, when it's pouring down rain, when it's hot summer. Lenny's there. He just stands right behind the rail, as the cameras pan around. And occasionally one of them will acknowledge, well, hi, Lenny, how are you today? And he just nods his head. I saw Lenny. He's walking down the street at Times Square. And I rushed over to him and I said, I don't know his last name. I said, Lenny. He looked at me and I said, you don't know me. I'm from Tulsa, Oklahoma, but I've been watching you on television for 30 years. And he stuck out his hand to shake my hand, and I was right. I was absolutely right. I had the right guy. And he shook Gail's hand, and he stood there and chatted with us for a minute. And I said, well, Lenny, I'll be looking for you. When I get home, and I'll be looking for you at the rail. How strange. So anyway, we had a good time. Somebody asked, did we eat in all these fancy places? Gail and I went through a phase back there 30, 40 years ago where we wanted to try all these fancy gourmet places. We went to San Francisco a couple of times, and we wouldn't eat anything that didn't have 5 stars, We spent far more money than we should. And then we discovered that with so many of those places, they give you less and less and just stack it higher and higher and charge you far more. Right, John? Less and less and stack it higher and charge you more. So we're past all that. We ate at Chipotle, we ate at TGI Fridays, we Dunkin' Donuts is one of our favorite places, So we Popeye's fried chicken, all sorts of things we ate. We didn't spend our money much on food. We spent it on the great art museums. So we had a good time. Thank you for being patient with us to take such a wonderful trip. And now we're home for the rest of the year, and I plan to be here every Sunday and looking forward to spending it with you. Any questions, any of you? Gail loved Lombardi better. She really did. I didn't know if she would like this football play. But it really is a human story play, how much Lombardi had riding on those games. And another interesting thing about that was Lombardi kept having lower abdominal pains. And the play shows that he was drinking Pepto-Bismol, and he kept thinking it was just nerves. It turned out he had colorectal cancer. And he did not have a colonoscopy. And by the time it finally was discovered, it was too late. And he died at 57 years of age. Yeah. So, that part was very interesting, too. But, to be made aware in a play like that even coaches of big football teams are very human. And they have the same dynamics going on in their lives that everybody else does, and how much it hurts when people boo them and so on. It was all, I thought it was really well done. It was a beautiful little theater in the round. And when we went to the half-price ticket place, is where we went. But there's one in Times Square, and our little book, Mary Wheeler and Dr. Brown gave us, loaned us, there's another ticket place down near the financial district. Same company and everything, and not nearly as many people go there. And so the first time we hoped to see a play, we walked up, and there were 3 or 4 people in front of us the first time. That's all. In Times Square, they've got bleachers there to seat people. It takes so long to get in line. Well, and not only that, but the one down near the financial district also sells matinees a day before, whereas the one in Times Square doesn't sell matinees till 10 o'clock or something in the morning of the matinee. So we looked at, they had a big board, tickets that they had available to them, and some that we would like to have seen, aren't being offered at half price yet. But I'd read about Lombardi and knew about it and who the players were, and I shared that with Gail. So we didn't know just what this theater would look like, but the guy said, I've got two on the third row. And so we bought those two tickets, and surely enough, we were on the third row, and it was a beautifully intimate little theater in the round, every seat just right on top of the stage. And, so they had to play to the whole thing. It was really, really well done. We loved Lombardi. And then the other theater was a very old one, as many of them are. But nonetheless, they had a good crowd. We went to matinees both times. We didn't really want to be out in New York so late at night, but when the Yankees got tied up with the Royals, we couldn't leave the game, So we ended up being out one night past midnight and riding the subway after midnight. But again, nobody acted threatening toward us in any way whatsoever. So that was it. Lombardi, though, I think, particularly if you enjoyed football, and remember who the characters were. Paul Hornung was he was a drinker and a womanizer and a gambler. He was suspended for 1 year because he bet on the games or so on. He said he didn't, but others said he was the wrong crowd and so on. And all that was borne out. Jimmy Taylor, they portrayed him almost as Neanderthal a little bit, that he came off as sort of slow talking and stuff, but what a football player when he played for LSU and then for the Green Bay Packers. And Steve Robinson, I thought they played him very well, a very bright and capable young man. So that was fun. And the wife, again, had some very important lines, very funny lines, and then, of course, there were very poignant moments, too, when things were not going so well. But a championship season, if you were asking for really sort of lines about human nature and so on, I think it would be the one, because it's about four guys who've really messed up their lives in many ways. And what was important to them in high school, they sort of lost the way. And now they're coming up on their 40th birthdays, and they realize they've made some wrong turns. And the old coach is trying to help them put things back together. So I found it very meaningful. I know some old athletes like that. I know a few. So, yeah. And I know how kids remember a high school football season. This was basketball, a basketball team. And one of the big things in the play is, why isn't the fifth guy there? Why isn't the fifth guy there? It takes five on a basketball team. And only in the last few minutes of the play do you find out why the fifth guy isn't there. And there's a significant reason, too. So that was interesting. Yeah. What? Gail doesn't know till this day why he wasn't there. She didn't catch that line, Oh. All right. Okay. The world did not end yesterday. I'm sure you noticed. Did you see my interview on Channel 8 Friday night? Well, they called me about 2 o'clock Friday. And I was at work. I was buried under a mountain of mail. I'd written the sermon before I left. But I'm trying to wade through all this mail that's come in, and all the emails and all the phone calls. And Channel 8 calls and wants to know, would I submit to an interview on the end of the world? Had it been 2 or 6 or 23, I probably would have said no. But Channel 8 means a lot to us. So I said, I would love to talk to you. When can you get here? And they said, within an hour. So I buzzed Judy Howe down at the desk. I said, Judy, Channel 8's coming to interview me about the end of time. When they get here, would you buzz me? And I'll come right down. And she said, well, they identified themselves to me and told me what they wanted, and I just knew you wouldn't talk to them about that. I said, Judy, Channel 8 means a lot to us. You buzz me when they get here. So, of course, they edit you down. They talk to me right here for 15 minutes, and they put 3 or 4 sentences up. But anyway, I did the best I could with that. So it was one of the questions the young lady asked me was, have you been getting a lot of calls from your congregation about this? And I said, not one. She said, really? Really? And I said, no, not one. Why do you suspect that is? And I said, because my people don't believe the end is going to happen Saturday. If they've been paying attention the last 31 years, they know that's not what I believe, and that's not the way we believe the Bible was put together. I said, if Rabbi Charles Sherman was concerned about something in the book of Daniel, or Rabbi Mark Fitzerman was concerned about something in the book of Daniel, I would suggest you become more concerned. If you heard that a professor, when we got on the plane Thursday night, I had a USA Today. This group had bought an entire page in USA Today, along with billboards and so on. They spent millions telling the world that it's all coming to an end on the 21st of May. And I read that page to see what they were saying. And it was a complete distortion of a little passage in Daniel that you and I have been through. And then a complete distortion of 2 or 3 passages from Paul's writing. I mean, I really couldn't believe they didn't deal with Revelation. They went to Paul and just had completely scattered. Made no sense at all of what Paul was doing. And so I said to this young woman, interviewer, if the head of the biblical department at Harvard Divinity School, Yale Divinity School, Princeton Theology School, any one of the 13 United Methodist seminaries said Paul's writing means, I would pay attention. But this poor soul who's putting out all this word is passing along the same ignorance from one person and one generation to another. They have no academic credentials at all. She deleted all of that, of course. What she put on the air was, she asked me, so what are you doing tomorrow? And I said, I'm going to see my 6-year-old granddaughter play soccer. And that's what she put on the air. So anyway, it worked out just as well. That's right. The guy will rewrite, the last 2 paragraphs and start all over again with a new date. That's for sure. Well, I had a lot of good things I was going to talk to you about from Matthew 10, but we can get to that next week, and I'll be here and be conscientious about that. We do invite you this afternoon. There are 3 things going on. The younger adult group, but it's not just for younger adults, in our church wanted to have a day at the ballpark, and so a number of them are going to the Driller game. They're going to have lunch together. There are several places there at the Driller Stadium that you can do that, arrange for groups, and they're all going to have lunch together and then see the Driller ball game. But Grant Carpenter, this very talented young man in our church, I told you, is going to be singing in Community Hall, about a 30-minute recital beginning at 12:30. And then we're having a reception here this afternoon honoring our district superintendent, Michael Chafin, and his wife, Leanne, for 7 outstanding years as our district superintendent family. The bishop is appointing him, it's already announced that he is appointing him new pastor of First United Methodist Church in Stillwater, which will be a very good place for Mike. He will do wonderfully well there. That church will love him and Leanne to death, and he will give them great leadership. So we can't grieve that. We grieve his leaving us. But we want to give them our love and best wishes. So it's a come-and-go reception in the parlor 2 to 4 this afternoon. If you'd like to come, you're certainly invited, of course. Punch and cookies, and just tell them how much they mean to you. Anything else you wanted to know about? I'll try not to be so personal next week. We'll get back to the Bible here. All right. All right.